On August 15, 1971, the financial world was at a turning point. President Richard Nixon, in a live broadcast speech, announced a measure that would change the global economy forever. He declared that the United States would abandon the gold standard, breaking the link between the dollar and gold. What seemed to be a response to a crisis was actually the beginning of a new era. The atmosphere in the room was tense. Staff and economists looked at Nixon, waiting for what would come next. The decision was made in a moment of desperation, with the dollar under pressure due to growing deficits and the Vietnam War. Inflation was rising and confidence in the dollar was deteriorating. The link between the currency and gold was becoming unsustainable. When Nixon announced the suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold, what was at stake was much more than just a monetary policy. It was the breakdown of a system that had supported the global economy since the end of World War II. The gold standard guaranteed a certain stability, and its removal meant that the dollar now became a fiat currency based only on trust. The markets reacted immediately. Gold began to soar, and uncertainty took hold of investors. That decision was not just a matter of economic policy. It was a signal that the world was about to enter a new phase, where currencies were merely promises, without any tangible backing. What was unfolding was a change that would affect not only the United States, but the entire global financial system. With the dollar detached from gold, countries began to reassess their reserves and strategies. What was once considered safe was now in question. The fear of devaluation spread, and nations began to worry about the stability of their own economies. It was a domino effect, and confidence in the American currency was being tested. In the following years, what became known as the Nixon shock would have lasting consequences. The global monetary system was transformed. Currency fluctuations became the norm, and financial crises began to appear more frequently. The world was entering an era of uncertainty, where speculation prevailed over stability. While Nixon looked to the future, the effects of his decision were still far from being understood. History would show that the break with the gold standard was not just a momentary necessity, but a step that would permanently alter the dynamics of global finance. From that day on, the dollar was no longer tied to anything but the faith of those who used it. The Nixon shock was not just a policy change, but a reconfiguration of the world economy. History teaches us that, in times of crisis, radical decisions can be made. However, the consequences of these decisions can reverberate for generations, shaping the future for all of us. Nixon's decision to detach the dollar from gold was not a total surprise to the most attentive observers. Since the end of World War II, the Bretton Woods system, which established the dollar as the world's primary reserve currency, had been showing tensions. The Vietnam War, with its exorbitant costs, and the expansive fiscal policies of the U.S. were putting pressure on the economy. The idea that the dollar could be sustained by gold reserves was becoming increasingly questionable. The immediate impact was profound. The price of gold, which had been fixed at $35 per ounce, began to rise rapidly. Investors, fearing the depreciation of the dollar, rushed to secure tangible assets. The increase in the price of gold was not just a reaction to a political decision. It was a reflection of the fear permeating the market. Those who had the ability to foresee the change began to seek alternatives, making gold a safe haven. Meanwhile, confidence in the dollar began to waver. Countries holding large reserves of dollars found themselves in a delicate position. The possibility that the dollar could rapidly lose value led to a reevaluation of their reserves. Nations around the world began to consider diversifying their international reserves, seeking other currencies or assets that could offer greater security. The reaction of financial markets was intense. In a short period of time, stock markets around the world experienced extreme volatility. Investors were on high alert, and panic began to spread. Currency fluctuations became the norm, and speculation started to dominate the financial scene. What was once considered a stable system began to look uncertain. What most haunted economists was the realization that the Nixon shock was just the beginning. The consequences of Nixon's decision were not limited to the gold market or the dollar. The The global economy was adjusting to a new reality. With the removal of the gold anchor, countries began to adopt more aggressive monetary policies. The idea of tight inflation control began to be questioned, and the idea of flexible exchange rates gained traction. The following years showed that the new era of fiat currencies was not just a transitional phase. Instead, it became the norm. Fluctuations in exchange rates became common, and financial crises became a regular phenomenon in the global economic landscape. What many saw as a system of promises ended up generating a cycle of uncertainties and risks. The rise in speculation led to a series of financial crises in the following decades. The stock market crash in 1987, the Latin American debt crisis in the early 80s, and the Asian financial crisis in 1997 were some examples of the direct consequences of an unstable monetary system. Each of these events was fueled by uncertainty and the lack of a secure backing. The financial world was in a constant state of change, and vulnerability became a common feature. Furthermore, the Nixon shock had a profound impact on economic policies worldwide. Countries that were previously dependent on the dollar as a reserve currency began to diversify their economies. The rise of the euro and other strong currencies began to challenge the hegemony of the dollar. The idea that a single currency could dominate the global stage began to be questioned, and economists started to envision a more multipolar monetary system. Meanwhile, inflation started to become a persistent problem. More flexible monetary policies, although necessary to respond to a changing global economy, also brought their own pitfalls. Rampant inflation was one of the legacies of the Nixon shock, with many countries struggling to control rising prices. The lessons learned from the experiences of the 70s and 80s shaped economic policy in the following decades. Reactions to economic challenges led to an increase in government intervention. The role of monetary authorities became more active, with central banks adopting inflation-targeting policies and interventions in financial markets. The idea that markets are self-regulating was challenged, and the need for stricter oversight and regulation began to be widely accepted. The Nixon shock was not just a change in monetary policy. It was a watershed moment that transformed the way the financial world operated. The consequences of Nixon's decision are still felt today. The global economy has become more interconnected, but also more susceptible to shocks. Confidence in fiat currencies, although still present, is constantly tested by crises and uncertainties. In hindsight, the Nixon shock represents a crucial moment in economic history, where decisions made in a time of crisis shaped everyone's future. As we look to the future, the lesson remains clear. Radical decisions can have far-reaching consequences, and trust, once shaken, may take generations to be restored. The impact of the Nixon shock transcended U.S. borders and reverberated around the world. As nations reassessed their dollar reserves, the concept of fiat currency began to transform into a common practice. What was once a system based on tangible backing now became a reality where trust was the only support. This change was not just an economic transition, but also a shift in mindset. Countries that had accumulated dollars as reserves for decades began to diversify their portfolios. Nations like France and Germany, which traditionally maintained large reserves of dollars, began to acquire gold and other currencies. The perception that the dollar could be vulnerable led to a rush for safer assets. This new strategy put additional pressure on the American currency, which was already facing growing challenges. The 1970s were marked by rampant inflation, known as stagflation, a combination of economic stagnation and high inflation. This era proved disastrous for many countries, which were not prepared to deal with the economic shock. High inflation eroded people's purchasing power, and economic growth stagnated. Governments found themselves forced to adopt drastic measures to try to control the situation, but these measures often only deepened the crisis. The response to this new scenario included the implementation of more aggressive monetary policies. Central banks, which were previously seen as institutions of strict control, began to adopt more flexible approaches. This included lowering interest rates to stimulate growth and injecting money into the economy. However, these efforts did not always result in recovery. Uncertainty persisted, and consumer and investor confidence remained shaken. The international context was also changing. The growth of emerging economies began to challenge the influence of Western countries. Nations like Japan and, later, China began to gain prominence on the global economic scene. This brought new dynamics and competitiveness, as these economies sought to expand their reserves and strengthen their currencies. The hegemony of the dollar, which once seemed unshakable, began to be questioned. The devaluation of the dollar had direct consequences on trade relations between countries. The cost of imports increased, and countries began to seek alternatives. The idea of a multipolar monetary system began to gain traction, where other currencies, such as the German mark and the Japanese yen, started to be considered as alternative reserves. This paradigm shift not only affected trade but also influenced foreign policy, as nations sought alliances based on more stable currencies. At the core of this transformation was the need to adapt to a rapidly changing world. Financial institutions began to restructure, and the role of central banks became more active. Oversight of the financial system increased, and regulation began to be seen as a necessity. The idea that markets are self-regulating was challenged, and the need for government intervention became evident. The financial crises that occurred in the following decades reflected this new reality. The stock market crash in 1987, known as Black Monday, was a strong reminder that instability was an intrinsic characteristic of the new system. Similarly, the Latin American debt crisis and the Asian financial crisis exposed the vulnerabilities created by the lack of a secure backing. Each of these events highlighted how speculation and uncertainty had become a part of everyday financial life. The legacy of the Nixon shock also included a new way of thinking about inflation. The experience of the 1970s led many economists to reconsider the relationship between economic growth and inflation control. The idea that inflation could be beneficial under certain circumstances began to gain acceptance. Central banks started adopting inflation-targeting policies, aiming to balance growth and stability. As the new millennium approached, the financial world continued to transform. Globalization and the interconnection of markets have made economies more susceptible to external shocks. What had started as a response to an economic crisis in a single country resulted in a reconfiguration of the global monetary system. The Nixon shock was not just an isolated event, but rather a catalyst that shaped the future of the world economy. In an increasingly complex scenario, confidence in fiat currencies remains a central theme. The lesson learned from the Nixon shock is that decisions made in times of crisis can have lasting repercussions. The challenge continues to be balancing the need for flexibility with stability in a world where uncertainty is the only constant. As we look to the future, it is essential to remember that history has the power to teach us, but also to warn us about the risks of hasty decisions. Before you leave, do two things now. Take a deep breath and hold on to what touched your heart today. And, if it makes sense, share this story with someone who also needs to hear it.